So you may have heard of a person called Dave Ramsey, and I know that I've mentioned him a couple of times, and you may have even heard of his famous baby steps. But what do they actually mean? And if you're like me and you're from the UK, can it actually work here? Well, of course, you've probably seen the title of this video. So in this video, I'm going to be outlining the baby steps and seeing how you can actually apply that to the UK too. Plus, I'll also be giving you my opinion on the baby steps and whether I think it's something worth working towards. Okay, Auntie V, let's take a step back. Who on earth is Dave Ramsey? Okay, so for me, if you've ever gone on YouTube and you've maybe looked at how to pay off debt or anything like that, then you may have come across Dave Ramsey. And I essentially think of him just as like a financial tycoon, especially when it comes to paying off debt as well. But what I thought might be good is, of course, having a look at the Google definition, because I'm pretty sure you guys already know I absolutely love doing this. So within the trusted source of Wikipedia, David Lawrence Ramsey III, which I had no idea that was actually his middle name, is an American personal finance personality, radio show host, author, and businessman. He's an evangelical Christian and hosts a nationally syndicated radio program, The Ramsey Show. Ramsey has written several books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Total Money Makeover, and hosted a television show on Fox Business from 2007 to 2010. Now, I have actually read his book, The Total Money Makeover, and I would definitely recommend it, especially if you are in debt and you're really just trying to get that motivation to pay off your debt and see what potential strategies that you can use. So definitely check that book out if you haven't already. I will link that in the description below for you. And of course, there are other personal finance and development books that you may want to check out, so make sure you take a look at the description below. So in terms of my own definition, I really see Dave Ramsey as the go-to person if you're trying to pay off debt. Now, before, I used to watch his shows all the time because it just gave me so much more motivation knowing that other people were in a similar position to me and they were trying to pay off their debt, and just seeing how he sort of communicates with other people and the tough love he gives. For me personally, I actually really needed that, and it just gave me so much more motivation to keep going and paying off my debt. And it's so clear that he absolutely hates debt because he always has this famous saying, debt is dumb, cash is king. So essentially, he has basically helped out millions of people with paying off their debt and eventually building wealth as well. Okay, great, I know who he is now. So what's with these baby steps? So for me, I kind of see the baby steps as basically Dave's own formula in terms of how you can actually start to build wealth overall, and making sure that the baby steps can basically apply to everyone no matter what your background is. So essentially what I want to do is now go over the baby steps and see how that would actually apply to the UK. So before you even start the baby steps, I think it can be sometimes called baby step 0, but what he really advocates for is actually being able to create a written budget. Now, in terms of budgeting, I think this can be applied to everywhere no matter where you're from, and I do think it's so important. So for me, I am a massive advocate for budgeting. I'm not sure how I feel about budgeting. Now, if you've never budgeted before in your life, or you feel like you do struggle with that, don't worry, Auntie V is always here to help. So I do have videos really talking through the budgeting process in terms of what other budgets you can do, and also I have my own budgeting templates as well. So if you are maybe looking for a monthly budgeting template or a weekly budgeting template, then I have got you. So definitely check out my links in the description below if you are interested. But essentially, before you even start with the baby steps, Dave is basically saying you need to have a budget. So in terms of baby step 1, what Dave suggests is that you need to have about $1,000 as your starter emergency fund. So if I was to apply this to the UK, just to be simple, I would really be thinking about having a £1,000 starter emergency fund. Now, the reason why he says that and not to actually have a fully funded emergency fund is because he thinks that you do need to have some cash before you start paying off your debt, but ideally you would want to pay off your debt relatively quickly. But the reason why you then have that cash is just so that you don't get into debt again. So for example, let's say that you've got credit card debt and you've got a car loan, and maybe you've got personal loans. If you start trying to pay that off as soon as possible and you don't have any cash, then you might be at risk of going into even more debt in case something happens. So for example, if your car broke down and you needed to pay money to fix it, but you didn't have cash, you might end up having to go into even more credit card debt to go and pay for that. So really, to just kind of mitigate those risks, ideally what you want to do is have a starter emergency fund, and that's why Dave advocates for about $1,000. Okay, Auntie V, so what's your opinion on this? So for me, I would definitely agree with having a starter emergency fund. Actually, in terms of the first couple of baby steps, obviously if you're including creating a budget, I would also be looking at my goals as well, because that's really going to help with motivation when you're thinking about, you know, paying off your debt and actually building wealth. So it's definitely something that I would want to do first, but in terms of actually writing a budget and having a starter emergency fund, I definitely agree with it. The only thing I would say is that with the starter emergency fund, I'm quite flexible, as I think it's going to depend on your personal circumstances and your risk tolerance as well. Because for example, depending on how much you earn and what your expenses are like, you might not actually need £1,000 as your starter emergency fund. For me, having about about £500 as my starter emergency fund was a bit more realistic, just based on the fact that I didn't necessarily have high levels of income and I didn't really have a lot of expenses either. And for me, the biggest emergency I think probably would have been something happening to my car. So if that was the case, then £500 probably would have covered it. And also considering where I was living, so I was only living in a house of multiple occupations, so I didn't really have many bills to pay with that, and I didn't have any dependents as well. So personally, I think it's really going to depend on your personal circumstances. £1,000 might be perfect for you, but it might be a bit too much or too little. So really just think about what's going to be best for you. And if you're liking this video so far, then feel free to give it a thumbs up, as it really does help to support the channel. Plus it's free. Okay, so I've actually saved up some cash for the first time ever. Now what? So with baby step 2, the idea is for you to basically pay off all debt is set for the house. Now in this case, Dave would want you to use the debt snowball method. So essentially what you're going to be doing is listing all of your debts smallest to highest, and then you attack the smallest one first, regardless of the interest rate. Now, if you've never really heard of the debt snowball method, I've actually got a video that talks about that in a bit more detail. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. I will of course link that up here for you and in the description below. But essentially he is telling you to pay off all of your debt apart from the house. So in this case, he is also talking about student loans. Now, when you're trying to apply this to the UK, this is where I think it can be very different. And the reason being is because our student loan system is very, very different to the US, and I cannot stress that enough. Now, I do actually have a video that really questions whether you should be overpaying your student loans or not, particularly if you are on plan 2. So definitely make sure you check that out. I will make sure that's linked in the description below. But ideally, he's talking about all other forms of debt. So for example, it could be credit card debt, it could be your car loans, any personal loans, and obviously in this case, the student loans. So do you agree with this step? This is really where I do think there are maybe some differences, because personally, I do believe that yes, I would want to pay off any forms of high interest debt as well, because I would agree that you would definitely want to pay off all forms of high interest debt. Whether you would choose the debt snowball method or the debt avalanche method or another strategy is really up to you. So essentially, I actually use the debt avalanche strategy, but I also really like the debt snowball method as well. But it's also going to depend on your behavior and your risk tolerance as well with that. But yeah, when I'm thinking about the UK, I would definitely agree with this step to an extent. I would want to pay off any forms of high interest debt. The only thing that I would probably leave out is the student loans, because again, we have a very different system to the US. So with that, it's really important for you to understand your personal circumstances, because it may or may not make sense to overpay on that. But anything else in terms of high interest debt, that's definitely something I would be doing once I've built a bit of cash as a starter emergency fund. Okay, I'm literally about to make my last ever car payment. I'm ready for the next step. So the next baby step is to save at least 3 to 6 months worth of expenses for a fully funded emergency fund. Now this is definitely something I agree with, and it's something that I did. So I started working towards a 3-month emergency fund. Again, it's really going to depend on your personal circumstances in terms of actually how much you would want in your emergency fund. Some people will actually prefer to have it a bit longer, so you might even have 9 months or 12 months, and some people might just be comfortable with 3 months. So again, you really want to think about where you're currently at, and there are just going to be other factors as well. So I do actually have a video that talks about that in a bit more detail, especially if you are looking to build your emergency fund. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. I will of course link that up here for you and in the description below. But for me, again, I think you guys already know how I feel about emergency funds. They are so important. So please guys, make sure you are working towards that, because again, when an emergency comes up, you want it to be an inconvenience rather than a total disaster. So I've actually heard there's an extra step before baby step 4. What is that? So really with baby step 3B, that is where Dave is talking about you saving up for your house if you haven't already. So I'm really talking about your primary residence here. Now what I like about this step is that basically Dave is telling you to first have your fully funded emergency fund. You shouldn't really have any forms of high interest debt, so you should have really just set up your financial foundation before actually starting to work towards buying a house. Now why I think that's important is because ideally you do not want to be broke as soon as you buy your house and have no other cash, because what happens if the roof collapses or your boiler breaks down and you essentially have to pay for it? If you haven't actually got money, you're going to end up going into debt to go and pay for that expense. So that's why I do think it's really important to first set your financial foundation in terms of actually paying off your debt and having your emergency fund before actually going to buy your house. So I've already got the house and I've done all the previous steps. What do I do now? Okay, so the next baby step is for you to start investing about 15% of your household income into retirement. Now, when you're thinking about the US, they are usually talking about things like 401ks, but I think within the UK, what you would probably be looking at is your workplace pension, for example, or you might even have a SIP, which is a self-invested personal pension instead. So essentially what you would be doing is taking 15% of your income and start investing in those retirement accounts. Now, I think this is an interesting one because you'll find that some people tend to start putting money towards their pensions early on, especially if you do have an employer match, because essentially potentially that can be considered free money. So it's really going to again depend on your risk tolerance and your personal circumstances. So as an example, I was actually putting money into my pension at the same time as building up my emergency fund, but I did temporarily pause my pension contributions whilst I was paying off my debt. The main reason for me is because I really wanted to just attack that debt as much as possible first, and then once I knew that I had done that, I could then start contributing back towards my pension. So again, it's really going to depend on you. I cannot tell you what to do with your money, but in this scenario, I would probably think about what's going to be comfortable for you. And then it's also important to realize that the reason why he does say 15% is because he wants you to also do other things in the other baby steps. So obviously we'll be going through that, but I think having a 15% number is actually quite a good one just in general, because I think at least it gets you started with thinking about your future. I've definitely set my foundation now, so I'm ready for the next step. So baby step 5 is to actually start saving up for your children's college fund. So really he's basically talking about saving up for university fees for your children. Now if you're actually trying to apply this to the UK, I think there are going to be different circumstances with this, particularly again because of the way our student loan system works. Now personally for me, I'm not sure I would start doing this before actually investing more into myself, but again it's obviously going to depend on your personal circumstances. I think with the UK it's quite different, and also the way things are going, my children might not even end up going to university. However, you could potentially maybe use it as an opportunity to just start putting money towards like junior ISAs, for example, so that maybe they can get their first house or maybe they can start their own business. So I'm just not really sure about the timing of it, but again, I don't currently have children, so that may change. So again, it's always going to depend on your personal circumstances. So baby step number 6 is to pay off your mortgage early. Now again, there have been many debates in terms of whether you should actually pay off your mortgage early or not, and I do slightly mention that in a video as well where I'm talking about whether you should actually pay off debt or start investing. So if you haven't watched that, then you can of course check that out. I will of course link that up here for you and in the description below. But essentially what he wants you to do is once you've actually started putting money towards your retirement account, so 15%, and you've also started saving up for your children's college fund, he then wants you to start attacking that house. Do you think I should really pay off my home early? Now again, personally for me, I think there are going to be pros and cons for both depending on your personal circumstances. But a couple of things I would say with this is, number one, I wouldn't just look at the numbers as well. So you do actually have to remember the psychological benefit of actually paying off your house early, but also it's going to depend on different things such as your age, maybe depending on whether that home is actually your forever home as well, and also your other goals, or thinking about how much cash or other investments you might have. But in my humble opinion, I don't think there is an either or. I think just depending on what you're comfortable with, you can do a hybrid of the two. So for example, if you do have disposable cash, you might decide to put a proportion of that into paying off your home and then another proportion into investing as well. Or potentially you could think about putting all of your disposable cash towards your investments, and then when it gets to a certain point, you might decide to take some of your investments out and then end up paying off the mortgage. So again, it's really going to depend on what you're comfortable with and your own goals as well. So make sure you're always taking that into consideration. Now this one seems like the most exciting one. So what do we do now? So baby step 7 is to build wealth and give. So really in this step, Dave is just essentially thinking about investing as much as you can, but also giving as much as you can as well. And of course, I absolutely love this step, especially the giving part. Personally, I would probably start giving as soon as I can. So even though I was in debt, I was still giving just because I think that's something that's really important to me, particularly as I'm a woman of faith. But again, it's really going to be up to you. But in this step, he really does advocate for giving as much as you can, as well as building wealth as well. Now in this step, Dave really talks about his investment approach, and he particularly likes mutual funds, where you would basically get a portfolio manager to actually manage your investments. Now in my opinion, that's something that I'm not necessarily a fan of. So I prefer to really just track the market. So for example, I would rather just invest in things like index funds and ETFs, and obviously if I have an interest in individual companies, then I may have a small proportion of my portfolio in that. But for me, I really just prefer the approach of just tracking the market rather than paying for someone to actually manage my investment portfolio. But again, that's just based on my own goals and my personal circumstances. Now if you have no idea what index funds or ETFs mean, don't worry, I've already got a video that really explains that in a bit more detail. So if you are looking to invest in the stock market as a beginner, then hopefully that video should help you out. So of course I'll link that up here for you and in the description below. Okay, so Auntie V, what are your opinions about the baby steps? Let us know. So in summary, I do think that most of the baby steps can actually be applied to the UK. Obviously there are going to be some differences with currencies. For example, when he's talking about $1,000, you're probably going to be thinking about £1,000 as an example. Now I do think there are going to be some things that you may not want to actually overpay on. So for example, with student loans, but I think inevitably with most of it, you can potentially apply this to the UK as well. Again, I would say I'm not 100% sure if I would agree with Dave's investment approach, but for me, baby steps 1 to 3 are probably the most important and the one that I stuck by. So really, again, getting getting cash before you start paying off your debt, then working towards paying off your high interest debt, and then getting an emergency fund. For me, those sort of three things were very, very important. And then I think it really just depends on your own personal circumstances in terms of what you might want to do next. So if you did like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, have you ever tried any of Dave Ramsey's baby steps? I do post every Tuesday and Friday, so if you would like to know more, then of course you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.